This stuff on the edge is like a little bit, I don't know, gummy or sticky or something, and it's like attached to elastic. What is that? Okay, well, I'm actually going to tell you what that is in this video. So, as you saw from the title, we are going to take in this wedding dress. It's a Mikado. That's the fabric, Mikado, and it's by Justin Alexander. And it has a very common construction that we see right now. The side seams are where we're going to take in the gown to size it down. It needs to go down a whole size. Just in the bodice, that's the top part of the dress. That's where we're going to bring it in. We have this little elastic belt. We have these hang loops to work around. And then we have that stretchy stuff with the clear, that's called silicone elastic. We have to deal with that as well. I'm going to show you a couple different ways to deal with that in this video. One is going to be kind of a deeper dive, and the other is going to be the easier way. Now, don't hop off here. I know you see this razor. A lot of people get scared. If you're uncomfortable with using a razor to open this top seam here, the understitching of the top of the bodice, just grab a seam ripper. It's okay. But I like to use the razor. It's faster for me. I'm not digging in and out, just kind of pressing along that row of threads and breaking the threads. So I'm going to open that understitching and the top edge of the bodice. That's revealing where this hang loop is going up. Now I'm going to open the seams behind that silicone elastic, and we're going to get that hang loop out of there. Stay tuned. I'm going to show you all the steps of how to take this in. So we're not just going to take it in at the top, but we're going to also kind of take it in at the top of the skirt as well, because the whole waist of the dress needs to be a little bit smaller. So we're going to taper into the hips with this project. So you'll get to see all that, learn all that. Now I'm just kind of scooching this hang loop out of the way. I'm going to lay it to the side. You can use that later. So this first side, I'm going to show you one method for dealing with the silicone elastic. It'll be a little bit more involved. And then after that, I'll show you the more simple method that I actually prefer and I use in my professional work. And many professional bridal sewists use the other method as well. So I'm going to snip this, and this is about how much we need to take it up. It's going to be a total of about 1 inch on each side. We're going to take this dress up, like I said, a full size. So that's going to be about 1/2 inch on either side of that side seam. And you can see when we join it together, the top is no longer going to align. That's a super common question that I get asked by people who are trying to take in a dress. So I'm going to show you also how to arrange that slope. And obviously we need to arrange that little taper, that little slope of the silicone elastic as well. Now I do like to clear out my threads as I work. Things can get a little messy. I like to keep it nice and neat. And with this video, you know, I have some videos that are 2 to 5 minutes long, lots of shorts that are a minute or less. But with this video, this is going to be longer because I don't want to skip a lot of steps. I want you to be able to see everything. So this is how I tunnel up to get to the inside of the dress. This is also a really common question that I get. I am at the center back seam of the train. I'm going to get rid of that hanger loop for the train. That's now a trip hazard. It is great in the retail environment to keep the train off the floor. It is not a bustle. So we remove that, and I'm just going to open up the lining here, create a little vent for us to work with. And again, this is a super common way to get into a dress when you have what we call a bagged hem or a fully lined hem. If you want to learn about the different types of hems and you know, you don't even know how to search for them because you don't even know the names of them, I do have a free hem identification guide. It's an illustrated guide, full color pictures of all the different kinds of hems that we see most commonly in formal wear, and I'll link to that in the video description. Now you see I'm tunneling through, and that's going to give me access to the inside of this dress. Now sometimes it's double lined, as in this case, so I've tunneled through. I will need to work on that layer sometimes, but you can see how it's still not fully releasing. I'm going to come back out and go through another lining layer. So no need to panic if you see a dress that has 2 lining layers. It's okay. Just try both of them and see which layer gives you access to which part of the dress. So now I'm in, and I'm going to kind of pull this through. Just don't let go. When you grab the part you need, pull it through. And I'm going to disconnect where they have this elastic connected to the side seam allowance. You can see that stronger boning there, and that wider seam allowance that lets us know we're at the side seam. Also, the fact that we held on to it when we pulled it through so we don't lose our orientation. And they're just doing that so that the elastic is kind of closely connected to that boning, so that elastic belt makes the boning feel really secure to the body. Now, just to orient you to the inside of the dress where I'm at, here's the side seam and that inner belt again. You can also, when you're done, just tack the waist seam together. That's a super common way of managing things as well, particularly if you are taking in the outer layer of the dress, the shell layer we call it, and the lining layer the same amount as you should. Some people skip some of that, and that's probably not best. So take it all in the same both ways. Now I need to release how these are tacked together at the top. That is just some leftovers from that hang loop. And I'm going to release some more of that understitching. That is an extra step that we do toward the end that keeps the bodice from rolling out too much. And I'll show you how to do that as well. Understitching can also be done two different ways. It can be done with machine or hand sewing. Do not get overwhelmed. I'm going to take you through this step by step. This is very just introducing what we're going to do, and then I'm going to show you it. Very bite-sized pieces, so do not get overwhelmed. I'm not one of those educators that throw out terms all the time and you get lost in the weeds. I'm not doing that to you. I'm going to tell you what the terms mean, and then I'm also going to show you. So here I am temporarily removing this wider boning that's on the side seam so that I can get to the side seams to take in the dress. And I just lay these to the side. Sometimes I do have to shorten them a little bit. And then if I did that, I would just recap it. And you can see the top is angled, and that corresponds with the top angle of the dress running down there at the side seam. So you can see how they've got the bottom of the seam allowance for the side seams folded up. And that's just so there's no pulling going on. I'm going to show you a different way of managing that. But if you like that, go for it. I find that it can sometimes show the imprint of that V on the sides, particularly with a fabric like this Mikado. It's quite flashy. You see lots of chiaroscuro, lights and darks, shadows and highlights going on in this dress. It's very dynamic fabric, but it is telling about everything that's going on the inside of the dress. So I'll show you another way that I like to sew that down when I put it back together that can help prevent some of the pulling that they're trying to avoid. Now I'm separating the waist of the lining from the waist of the bodice, and you can see that seam allowance for the lining is misaligned. We're going to correct that when we work on it. Just letting you get a good look at where we're working. You can see the bodice is there on the right, the back of the dress is on the left. As I said, Mikado shows everything, and we need to take care of the fabric. So we're going to make sure that we have a fresh needle in here. This is a size 14. Look at those turtle hands. That's important. You know why that's important is because we cannot put lotion on our hands, particularly when we are working with Mikado or any type of silk or satin. It's going to show. So my hands tend to get really dry, and I shoot in high contrast. So there you go. All right, so I'm going to sew down this side seam right along the original seam allowance. It's a good guide, and it's keeping the fabric together to prevent it from walking or puckering too much. And I'm doing that about a ½ inch from the original side seam, like I mentioned, and that's going to take it up roughly a full inch that we need. Now, after I stitch that, I'm going to go through and open up the original seam Again, if you're uncomfortable with this, you can use a seam ripper or whatever it is that works for you. And I'm going to go on down the line and open this up. I'm being super careful because anytime that you nick Mikado, you're going to have a little fuzzy spot left there. It does not heal over very well. And I want this dress to be able to be let out in the future if need be. So I'm going to open it up and just clean all the threads away. Next, I'm going to place the boning in there. And I'm going to start at the top where the cap is. A lot of times in manufacturing, they don't sew the cap on. They let the sewing that holds the boning in place keep the cap in place. So I want to make sure to run over that plenty well. And I'm going to keep this side seam allowance splayed open. And I'm going to make sure with my fingers, checking the bottom the whole time to make sure it stays splayed open. And we're going to sew down the boning on both sides. We are only catching the seam allowance. We're not catching any of the outer part of the bodice. This is just the boning and the seam allowance. So now I'm going to flip this around so that I keep the bulk of the dress on the left side of the machine head. And I'm speeding it up so I don't bore you. It's the same thing that we did on the other side. Now we're going to work on the lining layer. And that's the layer that has that silicone elastic. So this first way that I show you is going to be a little bit more involved. This is going to be kind of correcting the angle or adjusting the angle of the elastic before we take in the lining. And we're going to sew it down with machine sewing as opposed to hand sewing. That's the second method that I will show you. So instead of sewing my new seam alongside the original seam, I am going to go ahead and open things up and mostly just open up at the top. I do like the bottom part kind of being a placeholder for our guide for when we go in to sew in that new seam 1/2 inch from the original. But you can see when I open it up how these little tails of silicone elastic are loose from where we cut them loose before. And what we need to do is make sure that we sew them down so that the new angle feeds right into where they are going to align when we sew it back together. So it just needs a slightly steeper angle. You remember how I was showing you before, they don't align at the top, and we do have to readjust that angle at the top of the side seams. So let's just pin it and experiment and see where are they going to end up when the seam hits them right at 1/2 inch from the original seam, and get them in place. And I just kind of lay the fabric together, open it up together, and look at it and make sure that it aligns. So what I'm showing you here is the part coming from the front of the bodice is going to have to dip down a little faster than it did. And the part coming up from the back of the bodice is going to have to go up a little more toward the edge. Everybody has a different sewing style. I do like to make sure that this gets sewn into place a little deeper into the lining than what it was originally sewn. I just find it's a lot easier for it not to show or roll out later on. I'm going to lay down a row of stitches on both sides of the silicone elastic. Now, a common question I get is, how do I sew the elastic down by machine because the silicone is so grippy? Well, there's a couple things you can do. Some people put a piece of tissue between what they're sewing and the presser foot so they can kind of still see what's going on, but there's no gripping, and then they rip the tissue away. Others try a Teflon foot. I don't really have a problem with it to the degree that I need to make those changes. What I do is I just use this narrow left-right zipper foot. That is my favorite foot anyways. That's what resides on my machine probably 90% of the time. And it's narrow enough that it really doesn't pick up on the silicone grip as I'm sewing. So maybe if you're using a wider all-purpose foot, you might want to try this narrow left-right zipper foot. Now I'm going to show you how I sew down the other one, and what I will not show you is the adjusting that sometimes has to happen with this, because that could get boring. Now on this channel, I do not try to make everything look absolutely perfect and like I get it right perfectly on the first try. I just think that's mean to make other sewists feel like they're the only ones who struggle. We all have to go back and adjust. So don't feel weird about having to do that. I definitely go back and adjust this to make sure that it lines up nice and neat. We're getting ready to sew the lining. So we're almost halfway to the halfway. I'm going to make sure that the top bits align and that the bottom, of course, remember, is going to be a guide for us as well. Now let's just zhuzh on down that side seam. Now this part coming up is exciting because I cannot wait to show you how professionals join the bodice, that is the top part of the dress, to the skirt when we are taking in or letting out. First, let me show you, I am going to reinforce this elastic to just that side seam. But what we've done that's different from what you see for someone who's just trying to figure it out is, remember, I separated that bodice from the skirt at the waist seam. You also see that there was a sewing flaw here, that they did not align the ends of the side of the skirt lining, and so we're going to correct that at the same time. A lot of times we have to do that. I'm going to make sure they align, but I just opened that original seam a few inches because we have a quick taper. This bride, the dress fits her perfectly in her lower hips. It's just that transition from the waist into her hips that's still a little bit big on her. So what we're going to do is we're going to start at the top of this lining piece, a ½ inch in from that original seam. You saw I corrected it, made sure they aligned, but we started a ½ inch in, and then I'm going to taper quickly out to the original seam line. Since we did a ½ inch for the bodice and we did a ½ inch for the skirt, that means when we go to sew the waist back together, they're going to line up. They're going to be the same size. So a lot of times when people are just trying to figure it out, they just sew right through that waist seam, and there's some weird pulling that happens at the waist. This is going to prevent that. It's going to give you a nice, clean, professional seam at the waist. You can see how they align perfectly. If one was a little bit bunchy, a little bit bigger than the other, I would adjust that now at the side seams. But what you're going to do is you're going to splay these seam allowances open. Remember, the seam allowance is that extra fabric that's running down the side seams. We're going to splay them open, and we're going to turn the dress on its side, and right now we are sewing along the waist seam to reattach the bodice to the skirt. Please take a second to hit the like button and the subscribe button. It is such a blessing to me when you subscribe. Please help my channel grow. Now we're at the point that I was talking about earlier, where I don't turn up those little V-shaped corners, make a V at the waist. You're going to see all this fancy fingering. See how I put a little bump in there? I'm just going to kind of ease or just gently, barely bunch up that seam allowance at the waist. Not enough to actually cause a fold that would cause any type of bump on the outside of the dress, but just a little bit of a relaxing of that seam allowance. And I also do kind of tip the seam allowance up just a little bit for those side seams. That gives it just a little bit more room to float naturally within the dress when the bride is wearing it. So I do that anytime I do the side seams. If I have to take it up a lot and there's a lot of extra seam allowance, then I'm really going to kind of turn it up and ease some extra in there. But what I did there is pretty typical for what I do. And once it's really got some pressure on it from the dress, none of that puckering shows. Even though I'm really wanting to show this alteration in its full completion without a lot of editing, because I want you to be able to follow it step by step, I am going to hurry through this next part just a little bit. These are the outer layers. That's that extra layer of lining that was attached, and then we have our shell layer, that is the Mikado. And basically we're going to do the same thing that we did to the lining. We're just going to do that same taper and get it all sewn together. So I am going to edit this part out just for brevity's sake, but you basically rinse and repeat, right? Now we are back at the waist seam, easing in just like we did for the lining layer. These next few steps that I'm showing you are what really give you a professional finish at the top of the dress and keep it from rolling. So we are going to splay and ease those seam allowances at the top of the bodice just as we did at the waist, making sure we tip that seam allowance down and it follows the same path that the seam that we're putting at the top goes. This is just like building a little ramp. Don't forget, after this I'm going to show you the way to hand stitch that silicone elastic down, but here it is with it being machine stitched, and you can see how I said I like to dip it down just a little bit a ways from the edge, just because of the thickness there. I feel like it's just a little bit better hidden if we bring it down a smidge. Please do not skip this part. What I'm gesturing to is the way we're going to work the dress under the machine so that we can do our understitching. Now, there's different ways to do understitching. I'm going to explain what it is, but it's basically a row of stitches that keeps the top edge from curling out, and you can do it with the machine. I'm going to show you the machine stitch. This looks really, really good and professional. There's also a little risk involved. You can see how I'm kind of having to work it under the machine, and the entire dress, the right side, the outside of the dress, has to be worked under the machine. So to minimize this risk, you may want to remove your needle before you do it. The needle can scratch the fabric, and that can be almost impossible to repair. So think about removing the needle or just really taking your time. And I just make sure my needle is in the highest position and that the foot is kind of protecting the dress from striking the needle. And then I just really, really try to pay attention. But you're going to work your way up to where you can machine stitch at the edge of this dress. If you don't want to machine stitch it, you can do what most people do, even professionals. They just go through and they hand sew that understitching, and that works just fine. The machine stitch just looks a little bit more professional, so you may decide to favor that. So we've worked our way up to the waist of the dress. This is actually the most difficult part to get through, because now we have the boning that we have to push under this machine, but it's going to be just fine. We're going to force it under there without crimping the boning. Now, I was just gesturing to you that we were at the waist, and we're going to keep on going toward the very top edge of the dress. And the goal here is to have the shell, the outer part of the dress, kind of to the right of the needle. And to the left of the needle, we want all of the seam allowance of the edge of the bodice, okay? So you can see my fingers pushing on the underside. We're pushing the Mikado and the lining layers over to the left side of the needle, so that when we stitch, we are stitching through the lining and all of the seam allowance layers. We're going to stitch at the very edge, and we're going to stitch very neat and even with the angle that we made that edge of the dress to be. You can also see how dipping that silicone elastic down a little bit also gives our presser foot a little bit more room to work. It's the gift that keeps on giving. If you hate the look of it, don't do it. It's now time to put the hang loops back. You can reverse engineer it and do it the way that they were put in if you want. I do not prefer that method. I actually have a whole video on hanger loops and how to put them in, but I prefer to stitch in the ditch. I feel like this gives so much more stability to the bodice. It is unseen if you do it neat enough, and it tends to cause less curling out than what the other methods that come from the manufacturer cause. Again, you do what you prefer because your name is on the dress, right? But this is what I do. I just stitch on the outside of the dress. That's a quilting term, stitch in the ditch. And as long as the stitches are nested down into that seam, you have that support of the boning, and it's a nice long vertical stitch. It holds the hang loop in place. I make sure the loop faces the front of the bodice, and once you press the puff out of the side seam, it is very, very neat. Here's the part I promised you. I'm going to show you about how to hand stitch that silicone elastic down. Basically, all the steps are the same, except for you're going to skip the part about sewing the elastic down with the machine, and you're going to make sure they're pushed out of the way while you're sewing the new seam and the lining layer. Now you're going to align them and kind of do the same ramp idea that you did with when you were seaming the top edge. I'm going to hide that knot behind there, and I'm just going to travel with the needle in the depth of the fabric, pull it up, and just do a little tiny stitch that's on the outside. Do my traveling on the inside, come up for air for a little tiny stitch. Now I want to show you how I do this corner nice and neat, okay? I'm going to go all the way to the edge, making sure that they are pretty much stacked. I just want that under one to be just barely under the edge of the top one. I'm going to put a stitch tacking down both of the corners. Now I'm going to just smoosh that little under piece of elastic so that it's fully tucked under the over piece, so it really doesn't look like it is being overlapped. Triple knot it to secure it and press your work, and the bride is ready for the aisle. Check out this next video that YouTube just knows you're gonna love.